Hi folks, I'm Alan Watt and this is Cutting Through the Matrix on the 6th of November 2016. Now for the last few weeks I've been going over a lot of the data I've accumulated over my life to show you how the world is really run by so-called non-governmental organizations that simply appoint themselves or are appointed by the big foundations that fund them and train them. And they have think tanks too set out there to direct the direction of the world. That's what it's all about. That's what progressive means. There is an end to it where they want to take it all. And the end is technocracy to an extent where the elite, expert elite, have to run the world on behalf of their masters who are the really the economic elite above them. You find that Julian Huxley actually mentioned it in that way, in fact. So the scientific elites would run everything on behalf of their masters. And that's what we're going through drastically today. It's strange to me to just sit back and watch all this, the greatest show in history, really, for a long time, of politics. And the public have come such a long, long way, so far into this morass of being ruled by faceless bureaucrats across the whole planet, the United Nations, and all part of the one system. And I've gone through it so many times, so I won't go over it all again. But that's what runs the world, and we don't elect this system. It basically brought itself in, and gradually, until you're there, basically. They use the Fabian style of socialism, creeping to an extent, a few paces every few years. And you don't really think much about it until you'll find that you've got a wire fence right around you and you can't get out of it. Under your Agenda 21, 2030, etc. It's still Agenda 21, folks. It's the 21st century. They've got to accomplish everything in this century. That's the whole point of it. And their meetings are split up into 15 years. That's to get all the land away from you, to get the rural folk back into overcrowded cities, and to have your training completely composed of bureaucrats and all their workers, their social workers, you might say, training you and directing your lives like, well, what can you say, like little apparatchiks, as the Soviets would have called them. We're pretty well there with all the different agencies from governments. So when I look at the greatest show on earth in politics, it's just that I see politics as a kind of quaint, old-fashioned idea, because that's how the elite look upon it today. The public have no idea that, and that's what all these talks have been about, to show you that every year all these associations meet annually, and maybe 4 or 5 meetings each in each category per year, to sign new agreements and new agreements and new agreements to make sure they're international. And with every agreement, you sign away sovereignty, number one, of the people themselves, and then of the nation. That's what's already happened. Very old plan, on the go for a long, long time. Use different names not to frighten too many people in each area, and therefore people don't even see it coming. It's pretty well here. Now you take this first article here. It's a good one about a documentary that's come out. And I'll just rush through it a little bit, in fact. But it's called Documentary Unmasked Saul Alinsky, A Wolf in Sheep's Clothing. Remember, too, that was also the symbol of the Fabian Society that was set up to bring in a crawling speed, basically, rather than an outright revolution, which they would lose in England, for instance, or in Britain. The Fabian Society set itself up to bringing it in under the guise of socialism. And under socialism, they could get the working classes on their sides very easily, because they certainly had it bad. Because these guys always come in to look at disaffected peoples, and then they use them. Everyone gets used for a future which they can never envisage, because the elites know exactly where they're taking you, and they need an army to do it. Anyway, this is about Saul Alinsky, and it says he lived from 1909 to 1972. The Wolf in Sheep's Clothing is a work of father and son team Richard and Stephen Payne and their company Arcadia Films. And it tells you where you can purchase it, and on streaming video, or you can get the disc, I guess, somewhere else. The child of poor Russian Jewish immigrant parents, Alinsky was born in 1909, majored in archaeology at the University of Chicago, naturally Chicago, and later became a criminologist in the late 1930s when he worked as a labor organizer and focused his attention on organizing communities in places like Chicago's depressed back-of-the-yards neighborhoods, made famous in the book The Jungle by Upton Sinclair. After being mentored by the labor leader John L. Lewis, Alinsky founded the Industrial Areas Foundation. You can understand it's all to do with what's called organizing. Look for people who have got real genuine beefs and swing them over to back you. Then you all the different ones with beefs, regardless of the organization, on your side, and then the network. In other words, when you go to protest your particular beef, the rest of them join in with you from other areas, from different beefs. So that's how they get numbers. And that was a big idea between networking communities. MSS was trained community organisers around the country, aided by the liberal millionaire Marshall Field III. You're looking at him. Alinsky expanded his mission of inspiring and organising poor urban communities across America. And his 1946 book became a bestseller, perhaps even better known as his second book, Rules for Radicals, which contained an acknowledgement to Lucifer, who at least won his own kingdom. During the 1960s, Alinsky set up institutes to train other organisers, and his reputation as an activist grew. Now, remember, this is another thing you have to understand. The organisations I've been talking about for weeks now, and for a long, long time, maybe years, that run the worlds, run every side of everything that you think is reality. And they run the communist reality, the liberal socialist reality, Fabian reality. They run it all, folks. Because through, again, this technique of opposites, running all opposites, you get change. And then you plan the changes. But first you must get conflict. And it says here, in 1969, college student Hillary Clinton chose his work as a topic for a Wellesley College thesis. Clinton described Alinsky as that rare specimen, the successful radical. It's amazing how unaware people are of these realities that played such a major social role in the society in capturing the word liberal and then the term progressivist. Richard Payne, who wrote and narrates the film, son Stephen directed, told CNS News in order for people to not realize what was underneath. And then they peeled back the onion. Now here's interesting too. Alinsky never admitted to being a communist, Richard says. But he never said that he wasn't a socialist. In fact, he embraced that term, and that derives from Marxist theory. In his early life, as you see in the film, he's very much taken with the social sciences. And everything, that's why all the communists and all the weird things that are happening in society, they all come out of universities because the professors are strategically placed there. In every country. And it says, which abstract out of the reality of God to deal with life in a secular way. Stephen adds, he himself said, treat opponents not as persons, but as symbols. Now, in Technocracy, that's also how you look upon different organizations or groups of people to be used as symbols. Because in Technocracy, which again is what the Council on Foreign Relations adopted through the Rockefeller Foundation, the CFR, and it's a British one, where that was the big daddy of them all, because Britain was already conquered then. It was the Royal Institute of International Affairs. And that's now turned in to the European Institute for International Affairs that runs the European Union, this unelected body way above it. Going way back to Lord Alfred Milner and his group in the late 1800s into the early 20th century. In the film, Alinsky, played by the actor Jim Morlino, says the following: I knew plenty of communists in those days, and I worked with them on a number of projects. Things on and on and on. But anyway, I'll put this up for you to see. But what I'm showing you is that, remember, the wolf in sheep's clothing really originated from the symbol and the technique of the Fabian Society, which George Bernard Shaw and H.G. Wells and others, and the big Astor family that funded it all, for slow revolution, social rather than a bloody one, because Britain would definitely never lose if they started a bloody revolution. It had to be done by changing the people themselves and calling it something else, of course, not communism. So it's Fabian socialism. Remember what too was said by Stalin. Stalin said that communism is just socialism in a hurry. You see, same goal. And both of them believe, communism, socialism, always believed the same philosophy, that humans have to be managed by professionals. All humans, doesn't matter how old you are, managed by professionals for their entire lives. And the planet all had to be come into it too, so you get sustainability and so on and so on. It's all the one very old organization, and it's at the top. It's run by trillionaires. Trillionaires, folks. So I'll put this up tonight. Now, I can remember years ago coming out with all the stuff against the global warming nonsense, and putting out too the stuff that the same organizations working for the same UN-backed foundations and so on were prattling about the 1960s and 70s, the coming ice age. Then they changed to warming when that wasn't working out, and now the warming isn't happening. It doesn't matter though, they've got all their COP 21 and COP this and COP that one. So they've already convened so many times and signed them in laws, though because it's a religion, you see. And that's how the public must be taught it, as a religion, because it's not based on facts. And that ties in with Gorbachev, remember, who came over from Russia, and he was given that ex-military base to hold his foundation and to run his foundation. And he said in one of his books that they would bring in a new religion. He says, I myself, he said, I'm an atheist, but we, he said, shall bring in for the public a new religion, which must be based on a form of earth worship, very green. That would be its surface appeal, you see. And his foundation had the green cross on it. Under the guise of green, they would train the children to regard the earth as a holy thing, and their place in it was minuscule, and that way they could start bringing the population down to the planet, and they'd have willing little, characters who might help the unfortunates, or the excess populations to kind of exit, you might say. And that's where we are today with euthanasia and so on. This is just a start of it there too. Abortion first, then euthanasia, then you start bumping them off for all kinds of things, like headaches. And you wait and see. So this article says, absence of 21st century warming on Antarctic Peninsula consistent with natural variability. And it says, since the 1950s, research stations in the Antarctic Peninsula have recorded some of the largest increases in near-surface air temperature in the southern hemisphere. This warming has contributed to the regional retreat of glaciers, disintegration of floating ice shelves, and a greening through the expansion and range of various flora. Several interlinked processes have been suggested as contributing to the warming, including stratospheric ozone depletion, local sea ice loss, an increase in westerly winds, and changes in the strength and location of low-high latitude atmospheric teleconnections. Here we use a stacked temperature record, to show an absence of regional warming since the late 1990s. The annual mean temperature has decreased at a statistically significant rate, with the most rapid cooling during the austral summer. Temperatures have decreased as a consequence of greater frequency of cold east-to-southerly winds, resulting from more cyclonic conditions in the northern Weddell Sea associated with a strengthening mid-latitude jet. These circulation changes have also increased the advection of sea ice towards the east coast of the peninsula, amplifying their effect. Our findings cover only 1% of the Antarctic continent and emphasize that decadal temperature changes in this region are not primarily associated with the drivers of global temperature change, but rather reflect the extreme natural internal variability of the regional atmospheric circulation. So after all that mouthful, it comes down to just a normal variability, a natural internal variability of regional atmospheric circulation. Because it's never the same one year from the next. That's what temperature is about. Changing temperature. You see. It changes. And I'll put that one up. And then we do this one here, which is top university stole millions from taxpayers by faking global warming research. See, all these professors who are on board with all this are lining their pockets and their careers, actually, because they live on grants. And without this scam going on, they'd be, I don't know, looking for a job sweeping the streets or something. Top universities stole millions from taxpayers by faking the results of global warming. A global warming research centre, the London School of Natural Economics, awfully important place, that London School of Economics, because that was also set up by the Fabian Society, for those who don't know that. Got millions of dollars from UK taxpayers by taking credit for research it didn't perform. An investigation by the Daily Mail revealed the UK government gave $11 million to the Centre for Climate Change Economics and Policy, CCCEP. It's almost communistic, because you look at the old names for the communist system, in exchange for research that the organisation reportedly never actually did. Many papers CCEP claimed to have published to get government money weren't about global warming, were written before the organisation was even founded, or were written by researchers unaffiliated with CCCEP. The government never checked CCCEP's supposed publication list, saying they were taking it on trust, according to the report. Now, why would your government be on board with that on trust? Don't believe in coincidences, folks. You know, any more than the coincidences that all the media in the US wanted basically to see Donald Trump shot, back to the wall and shot. That wasn't coincidence either. They were all colluding together, because there's no free press, as I keep saying. Something manages it all. We above them all. Anyway, it's a serious misconduct to claim credit for a paper you haven't supported, and it's fraud to use that in a bid to renew a grant. Professor Richard Toll, climate economics expert from Sussex University, whose research was reportedly stolen by CCCEP, told the Daily Mail, "I'd never come across anything like it before. It stinks." Of course, we came out before. The reason all fake stuff before, years ago, when all the scandals broke out with the emails back then. Researchers whose work was misrepresented were furious. One professor said CCEP's actions were a clear case of fraud using deception for financial gain. Well, that's how the system runs, isn't it? Yeah, and it says, the CCCEP tried to falsely claim credit for research it never did, while attempting to get another $5.4 million of government cash. Everything's corrupt, folks. Everything's a scam, and it's corrupt. It says that money would have covered its operations until 2018. Our paper had no relationship to the CCCEP, Toll said. At the time, the CCCEP didn't exist. It only came into existence after the paper was published. Fraud means deception for financial gain. That is what this is. Well, the whole system of it is for not just financial gain, which it certainly is. It's for total control over all our lives, if you go into it very, very deeply. Again, by these faceless, bureaucratic technocrats. See, they couldn't get what they wanted all these years by all the old persuasion techniques, and they're even a bit behind on their indoctrination at school techniques, a little bit, not much. So the best way to do it was to get governments to all get paid off, of course, naturally. All your politicians are easily paid off, and I'm very happy to get paid off. That's their nature, of those who seek power, and go along with it all, the whole UN agenda. It crowds into cities, bringing down population, it's unsustainable, blah, 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 down to austerity. That's all part of it too. They've actually had speeches recently about it, quite openly at the United Nations, about the need to enforce austerity into North America and other countries in Europe. And make energy so expensive, its effects will be felt. Well, if you go into what they've done on their studies into energy for technocracy, it means that the birth rate not only drops, you find a lot of the death rate amongst children goes up as you deprive them of their heat, and all the different power and so on. That's all part of taking down the population. For if you can't get it, well, there's nothing to help you. Nothing at all. Anyway, that's one article there. And then we got this one here. Caught on tape, UN bans skeptical journalists from climate summit for holding views not what they called particularly helpful. See, everything's rigged. Everything's rigged, folks. Anyway, UN official Nick Nuttall on why conservative media outlet is being banned. I don't see what they're actually reporting as being particularly helpful. That's what the UN told them. Even establishment and warmist CBC was having none of the UN's excuses. And the CBC said to the UN, do people have to prove that they're helpful in order to be accredited journalists? So it does seem that what Mr. Levant was saying is true, that you didn't like his point of view. And it's true, so they only want, do you like or dislike? Do you believe, do you not believe? Do you understand how everything ties together and how you've all been trained so easily? So anyway, the UN has rejected the media credentials of 3 journalists from a conservative news outlet in Canada to the upcoming UN Climate Summit in Morocco in November. Nick Nuttall, a UN official, admitted in an October 18 CBC interview, we used to call that Communist Broadcasting of Canada, which is pretty well what it is, that the rebel news outlet is being banned from attending the UN summit because of the sceptical reporting of the UN's climate claims. Nuttall tried to justify the UN media ban by noting that the rebel TV host Ezra Levant has called UN-promoted climate change fears a crock. What does calling climate change a clock add to the public's understanding? Nuttall asked the CBC. And the UN's Nuttall told the CBC, I don't see what he's actually reporting, as being particularly helpful. But much to the shock of the UN official, the warmest Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, CBC, Carol Off, was having none of it. Do people have to prove that they're helpful in order to be accredited journalists? Off, who hosts As It Happens program at CBC, asked the UN's Nuttall. A clearly flustered Nuttall responded, well, what do you think journalism is all about, or is about? And then they go into this thing about journalism and so on and so on. But it doesn't make any difference because it's law. You see, this has all been made law as you're all sleeping away or distracted with other things. And by God, they're awfully good at distracting you, aren't they? Yeah. Aren't they really? You've got to admit it. You've got to hand it to them. And then you get this one here with UN with new climate scheme, green transformation unstoppable. And it says, if the world ever does heat up from the alleged man-made global warming, the United Nations and its largely unfree member regimes seem determined to make sure you endure it with no air conditioner or refrigerator. But the latest development in the UN's green agenda is about much more than waging war on prosperity, liberty and cooling. Technologies under the guise of saving Mother Earth, as UN leaders made clear in recent days. And I've read all these articles years ago, and it's just like repeating it all to me, but they've said it all again. The so-called green transformation of the world towards centralized control and global governance is now unstoppable and irreversible, claimed the UN environmental czar after a UN summit in Rwanda last week. Did you hear about that when all this stuff was going in the States? No. Close to 200 governments and dictators agreed to amend the Montreal Protocol to unleash a new jihad on important molecules used in everything from air conditioners and refrigerators to medical inhalers. Bring down the population, eh? Contrary to the senior UN bureaucrats' grandiose and bombastic heralding of the unstoppable new order, though the UN's much-touted green transformation of the world is on shakier grounds than ever. In fact, it could all come crashing down as soon as this year if GOP presidential candidate Donald Trump wins and follows through on his campaign promises, or if the GOP-controlled Congress grows a spine and cuts off the tax funding. Don't forget the UN and the thousands of organizations have destroyed everything in order to rebuild them in its own image on behalf of its own master. And don't forget the Royal Institute for International Affairs set up the United Nations. And it's private, an organization, the Royal Institute for International Affairs. And now they also run the ones for the whole of Europe, the European International Affairs organization. It's beautiful, isn't it? And very few folk even know that. Huh? But they'll know every actor and actress's names in the latest soaps or rubbish on TV. Anyway, it says, It could crash down if they go spine and blah, blah. And if Donald Trump wins and follows through on his campaign promises. Carbon dioxide, known to scientists as the gas of life, has been public enemy number one at the UN Climate Conference in recent years, even though it's vital for life. Establishment media organs such as the New York Times even parrot the ludicrous terminology of Al Gore. Al Gore, again, in with the technocrats and the Trilateral Commission, that's all part of the CFR, by the way, which is part of the Royal Institute for National Affairs. It's all one organization, folks. All private. And it runs all the countries, nations, parliaments and governments. And they always, like Al Gore, always make sure they give themselves the best of massive profits as they tax you to death with carbon taxes. It's beautiful, really, this gang, this incredible gang at the top of the planet now. Anyway, demonizing the wonderful molecules of carbon pollution. That is despite the fact, or perhaps because of it, that the beneficial gas is exhaled by every human being on the planet, and it's essential to life for all plants and so on, and it's released by literally every human activity. See, you're the enemy. Remember the article I read years ago? From the other big Club of Rome think tank? Where they were given the task by the big boys at the top to find a reason, something that people would fall for, to give all the rights away so they could be managed and their numbers brought down and so on and so on. And after looking at all the possible things from the sublime to the ridiculous, including all the UFOs and MA, they had to come together to fight all the invasions from outer space. Tried everything, but eventually they got more practical and said, well, man is destroying the environment, and therefore man's the enemy. Man himself is the enemy. That's what they jumped on, you see. And you breathe out, folks, and guess what? That's going to be a reason shortly to sterilize most of you. At the very least. I mean, at the least, because these folks, from their creation of this old Soviet Union through the Bolshevik Revolution, have been slaughtering people across the planet for a long time. And they mean business, because they do see you as a symbol. They don't see you as individuals. You're simply a collective, the wrong kind of collective, the contaminated collective. That's what the Soviets, because it was run by the same folks. The Soviets said they would create a utopia, and everybody would obey government. That was a replacement for the deity. That was the new deity was government and science. And it was utterly stinking and corrupt at the top by folk who lived like kings and queens, while everybody else down below, if they didn't go say anything, if they didn't believe or what they were getting taught at school and so on, were put in mental hospitals, because you had to be a mental case not to see you're living in a paradise, a worker's paradise. And you think that's in the past? No. It's the same organization that's on steroids now for the whole planet. If you haven't figured that out. And the Soviet system, for its entire existence, was fed by the West. At the costly UN Environment Program, UNEP, United Nations again, summit in Kigali, Rwanda, a place infamous internationally for genocide and mass murder, is very appropriately facilitated by the UN and its civilian disarmament schemes. The UN and its mostly autocratic member regimes took aim at a different supposed foe, hydrofluorocarbons, also known as HFCs, used in cooling and refrigeration. Under an amendment in an existing UN scheme, the 1987 UN Montreal Protocol on substances that deplete the ozone layer, national governments of more prosperous nations will start phasing out HFCs within the next few years. Dictators and corrupt governments that have impoverished poor nations will have a decade or more to start phasing out the crucial chemicals. Richer nations such as the United States will have just a few years. So we're going to do away with something that gives you cooling in very hot areas of the world. They already have folk, if I mentioned it last week or the week before, folk dying in different parts of the US because they can't afford air conditioning anymore. And that's again part of the technocracy of jacking up the prices on all energy. In Britain, of course, they have, every winter, it's quite natural now to have the people dying in their own homes because they don't have literally fuel credits. They're allocated fuel credits if they're retired or whatever. So it's okay for them to die. You understand? As you read these articles, even subconsciously it sinks in that life isn't worth a darn. And if you're doing nothing about it, eventually it's going to work its way around to you. I'm not kidding. And your children, if you have any. Ironically, despite the name of the relevant UN regime stating that the treaty deals with ozone-depleting chemicals, nobody has yet claimed that HFCs deplete the ozone layer. Like everything else, that's all rubbish science. And if it's not meant to be science, you understand, it's meant for the ignorant to be taught to believe in through indoctrination. In fact, HFCs were developed as a response to previous UN bans on other chemicals that allegedly depleted the ozone, though even that was never proven scientifically. In fact, it would be impossible to destroy the ozone layer anyway, since ozone is constantly being created in the atmosphere naturally. Ozone is a molecule consisting of 3 oxygen atoms, and it's formed when ultraviolet light breaks an oxygen molecule consisting of 2 oxygen molecules into its component parts. And one of the oxygen atoms combines with the O2 oxygen molecule to form ozone, which is O3. Put simply, so long as oxygen in the atmosphere is not depleted and there's ultraviolet light, the ozone in the atmosphere will not be depleted either. But the UN's chief environmental bureaucrat explained this scheme is much bigger than just battling life-saving chemicals under the guise of supposedly controlling climate, the ozone, or anything else. It's about a fundamental transformation of the world. It's about much more than the ozone layer and HFC. It says, this is from Executive Director at the UNEP, Eric Solheim. It's a clear statement by all world leaders that the green transformation started in Paris is irreversible and unstoppable. Well, you know what you do? You take out all these agreements and you tear them all up, folks. You tear them all up. Because you don't vote for any of these characters or any of these organizations, and you've been your whole life under something that is not democratic in any possible sense of the term. And they've been training you that somehow it's supranational. It's like a God thing. That's United Nations, not its organizations. Anyway, I'll put this article up too. It's just disgusting to me. Disgusting. And UN Habitat 3 pushes compact cities. They just had the Habitat 3 when, again, all this fiasco with politics was going on. And the world repeatedly described as under the threat from innumerable challenges, including income inequality, inadequate urban infrastructure, discrimination against minorities of every stripe, and climate change. Participants at the UN's Habitat 3 conference in Quito, Ecuador, were told that comprehensive planning aimed at densely concentrating people in urban areas offered the best way forward to a sustainable future. I read this stuff years and years and years ago. Addressing the Habitat 3 on the conference the first day, Serge Salat, director of the Urban Morphology Lab in France, said compact cities with residents living as close as possible to public transportation should be the goal of urban planners. He noted that ready access to public transportation would mean residents would no longer need cars to take them to work and recreation. This, he added, would make forward-looking cities leaders in the fight against climate change. Salat's panel at Habitat 3 discussing green solutions to climate change and other urban problems. Salat, it should be noted, is an advisor to the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. See, it's all one big massive scam working together, and you didn't vote for any of it. Then they talk about creating open spaces in wild areas and how to take more and more land off the people and so on. You can't go into it, etc., etc. And so in other words, by making land off limits for people to live and work, they will have little choice but to settle in densely populated urban areas. If parents prefer raising a family in a suburban environment, they will have to think again. Under this scheme, central planners will stack the deck in favour of compact cities. This is a new urban agenda and the world's poor. Welcome to Habitat 3's new urban agenda. UN functionaries green non-governmental organisations, none of these folk you vote for, folks. I mean, they'll work for the big foundations, which are all one big club. And their allies and national governments want to see this top-down globalised agenda imposed around the world. And it says the world's poor and the most vulnerable. They're right, but what they refuse to see is that their schemes will put the poor at even greater risk. Limiting the amount of land that's available for homes drives up the cost of housing. Promoting unreliable, unaffordable renewable energy drives up the cost of electricity. In both cases, it's the poor who end up on the short end of the stick. And I'll put that up again as these big evil... to most focused, nameless and faceless bureaucrats run your lives, and you don't elect any of them. Any of them. Also, the UN doesn't like the way you live. It's another article. I'll put that up too. It says UN's Habitat 3 conference in Quito, Ecuador are exhorted on blue and white UN colours billboards to do their best for the world's cities. And they go through the compact cities again. So back to the United Nations again. This thing, again, is supranational. Most folk just take it like it's there, like money's there. When children see money as normal because they grew up with it just there. So it must be normal. And apart from that, they know nothing else about it. The same with the United Nations. It's there when you're born. It must be normal. And it's somehow you don't vote it in. In fact, they don't even think that far about it. It's already putting itself in some sort of supranational, godlike place. And you don't vote for it, as I say. Where is it situated? In the US, of course, naturally. Because the US primarily funds it all. And this is literally a way of taking over the planet, if you haven't figured it out, on behalf of an elite, a global elite. Anyway, Antonio Guterres is confirmed as the next Secretary General of the United Nations. The socialist, he's Socialist International. You see, their name for communism, folks who haven't figured it out yet. Who, again, is an elitist, complete elitist, where the experts should run the planet, you see. And you're all faceless masses, and that's what it's all about. Anyway, the socialist former Prime Minister of Portugal has been confirmed as the next Secretary General of the United Nations. Taking over at a time when the world is rocked by terrorism. Oh my goodness. All planned again, run by, again, where else? It was funded from the US, the terrorism across the planet, as we all know. Reeling from the refugee crisis and struggling to resolve the war in Syria, as they fund ISIS and created them too. Old stories, eh? Antonio Guterres, a 67-year-old former Secretary of Socialist International and head of the UN's Refugee Agency, will succeed Ban Ki-moon on January the 1st. On Thursday, the UN General Assembly approved the recommendation made by the Security Council on October the 5th. And it says, speaking 10 years to the day after his own appointment as Secretary General, he says, Secretary General-elect Guterres is well known to all of us in the hall. Well, he is to them, this private club, you see, that runs our planet on behalf of their masters. And it's a big rah-rah-rah for this nonsense. Guterres was also in charge of bringing lots of, up in all the quotas of this so-called migrants. It's amazing how many different terms have used for this nonsense. And you'll find that too when you're in a lot of nonsense, like this wiping out Europe and so on. That's the intention of it, whole Europe, to bring in the new. Then you'll find they have different terms. They themselves give you different terms of what to call them to confuse you, rather than you call them what obviously it is, you see. Anyway, Guterres has said that he intends to make preventing crisis a priority. We need a surge in diplomacy for peace, he says. Where's he going to start? Remember, it's the NATO armament group, of course, they run there too, from the United Nations. That's the military wing of the United Nations. The same ones that bomb Libya and other countries too. The international community spends much more time and resources managing crisis than preventing them. Well, you see, that's because we're not in charge of our own countries. And what do you mean the international community? Most folk in one country are as ignorant as the folk in the next country regarding this international community, because we're out of the picture. We get no say in it whatsoever. But you see, you're supposed to start using these terms, international community. It says that the nomination by finally winning over the Russians who were believed to be blocking his candidacy. I wonder why. It's amazing how Russia's, they used to be communists. It's because they knew who was running their country. That's because they had experience in it, you see. So, so they're trying to block him getting in because they know exactly what he is. So I'll put that up tonight too. And then I've got this one too on his wiki page. I'll put that up as well, the link, and you can have a good look at that. And you can find his elitist policies there called socialist, and how they should run the planet and all the rest of it, and how he's worked with the European Union for a long, long time. Don't forget that they'll all be members of the, not just the Royal Institute for International Affairs, but the ones behind it, which created the European Institute for International Affairs for the whole of Europe, rather than having to take one country at a time and run them quietly. One big club, you see. I'll put that link up if you want to find out a bit of his history there. But he's subservient to the bosses that rule the world. Now tonight too, I'm going to put some links up, awfully important, because a professor in Canada, in Toronto, University of Toronto, called Jordan Peterson, has taken up the challenge to this political correctness that everyone's getting forced to bow down to. And as he says, how can you possibly teach if people are restricting the language and the words that you actually use? And then they're telling you to replace the words you would use with these vague or else ridiculous sounding names. They can often, I suppose, mean the opposite. But he's got videos up of how this all started, and I'm telling you, you've got to watch them, because he's pointing out what's going on, where you are right now. He's pointing out where you are, how you're already under tyranny. And believe you me, the group that's pushing this tyranny, universities, is subservient to the big bosses at the top, or the globalists, big boys at the top, planned this all. And he talks about gender studies and all the rest of it, and how they're, again, as I mentioned before, about how communism, the Bolsheviks, etc., and then communism in the USA especially, would go to every little group that had their own particular beef about whatever, and network them together to get more and more numbers. And so when you went on a demonstration, you would think, my God, there's an awful lot of folk really demanding the government changes this or that. But in reality, it's all different groups that only network together for the demonstrations. But anyway, that's how you rule the world, by demonstrating in front of governments and parliament until you get what you want. Only because the governments have been tipped off, or your parliaments have been tipped off, and the parliamentarians, to go along with this and let them have what they want, because it's the agenda. So I'll put this up tonight. Jordan Peterson, and he's a clinical psychologist, and you got to look at these videos, and maybe you'll start thinking for yourself. I've touched on it before too, with the whole idea of democracy. Democracy, remember, is supposed to be majority vote, vote of the people, with regards to listening to and not persecuting minorities. But when you see that they're using really small minorities to persecute the rest and rule over you, something's happened here. It's not democracy anymore, is it? It's not. Come on, let's be honest here. But, as I say, this is a big, massive organization that's running the planet altogether, and it's a very old organization. As I say, Lord Alfred Milner goes back to the 1800s, and even Winston Churchill, in one of his speeches, said that he had been ignorant of it. He didn't know what the name of it was. He knew it was existing. He knew it was manipulating government policy, and even working against him at times when he was head of Britain. And he was furious at it, that literally he saw it as a subversive organization. They were using Britain at that time as a battering ram for empire to rule the planets. And then the same body of organization ran all the banks, the world banks and all the rest at that time, because they created it too in the central banking systems. And they also used crisis to push globalistic solutions to the organizations which they then created, the League of Nations. And then when they call themselves the Organization of International Affairs, then they created the United Nations, the World Bank, the Bank for International Settlements, etc., etc. This is all the same old system. Using all different groups. And the groups themselves often don't know. The followers never know anything. Followers never know what they're getting used for. Anyway, it says, this one here, this is awfully good too, because I mentioned this a couple of weeks ago about a particular central bank or banker for Greece it was, and he talked that the EU bank, the central bank for the EU, kept pushing loans on Greece when it couldn't pay up the previous loans back, and he said no, so they got rid of him. And I put the link up before where you hear him discussing this with Noam Chomsky. And but he did mention this. He didn't know. He thought that literally that this banking group that was under the central bank were responsible to the governments and so on. He didn't realize it was a shadow group under Thomas Wieser. Well, I'm going to put a link up tonight to hear Thomas Wieser, who is the real boss of the money system and the banking union. And he's given a talk to fellow members of, guess what? The Institute for International European Affairs. Same organization. That no one elects. They drafted up the EU agreement, who had drafted up the whole plan to merge the European countries into one. So this is the character who's in this non-democratic system, completing the banking union. Awfully good information as he's talking to some of his definitely lesser equals. He's not giving you all the stuff out all the cats out the bag, you might say. But Wieser does talk about the bail-ins, how they're centralizing everything for the bail-ins, etc., and what they might have to do. That goes with the Bank for International Settlements, the World Bank, because that's at the top of this big organization. And we've all signed on, all our countries signed on, if you don't know that, last year I think it was, for the bail-ins, if they need to do so, just to steal your money out of the bank. So I'll put that up tonight too. I'll put up Thomas Wieser's wiki link, what they'll tell you at least, and his political career in the European Union. And he's the president of the Economic and Financial Committee of the European Union, as well as the president of the Eurogroup Working Group, EWG, which is an advisory body to the Eurogroup, and the EWG doesn't get elected either. So they meet once a day before the Economic and Financial Affairs Council. Good name it's called. It's called ECOFIN. I guess that's where they take the money out. And council, and maybe the people are trying to pay all their debt off. Council and pre-agrees all ECOFIN's decisions on Eurozone affairs. And former Greek Minister of Finance Yanis Varoufakis claimed that Wieser holds considerable power within the Eurogroup, stating he's been part of every policy and every coup that resulted in Greece's immolation and Europe's ignominy. Sven Giegel, member of European Parliament, German Green Party, has stated in his correspondence with Varoufakis that Wieser is acting under the auspices of representatives of all finance ministries in the Eurozone, which forms the Eurozone Working Group. So there you go. Beautiful system, isn't it? So democratic. Most folk don't even know all these things exist. And the whole NAFTA deal was planned and drafted up by the same group too, this private organization. And they've got lots of articles out there. I've got stacks of them here. I've read lots in there. And also I've got more. If I'm not totally fed up, I might give you some more in the future. But the whole idea is to integrate the whole of the Americas together, same as Europe, under this incredible system that just plunders you and plunders you and plunders you, as you all have to bail out every other country that they've made part of it. Quite some, eh? Isn't that some? Now it's interesting to see Pierre Trudeau's son take over Canada and promote the same kind of things that his dad was pushing. Remember his dad, I think it was 1952, was the head for Canada for the Communist Party, Young Communist Party, and he led a delegation, I believe, over to, at that time it's called the Soviet Union in Russia. But what's interesting is it's the same old thing. Anyway, the son's come out and said, now that he's Prime Minister, that Canada has no core identity. It's kind of a post-identity country or whatever, no core identity at all. And there's articles there decrying the nonsense that he's come out with. But it's quite interesting to see both sides of everything. To me, it's quite funny, you know. And understand that people can't really tell the truth, I think, in any positions of power. I don't think it's in their nature, number one, to do so. But they'll stick to their guns, so to speak, even if they're beaten logically in an argument. And that's why things often sound insane from their own mouths. Rather than say, yeah, we're wrong, or, you know, they'll never say that. They'll stick to their particular party line or whatever it happens to be. Because logic must be logical. Logic cannot just be logical for in one phrase of their speech or talk or whatever, and completely illogical in the next paragraph. It can't be. It's going to be continuous logic. And you've got to basically show and prove that whatever you're standing for is worth standing for, and you give the principles of why it should stand for that way, etc., why it's very humane for society and things like that. But they can't. They can't. And I think it's true what Bertrand Russell said, and Bertrand Russell worked for the world's dominators that were setting up the culture for the future that we've all gone through, right down to bringing down the population. He's all part of the agenda for that, to destruction of marriage, all these things for the West. But he did say that people are not logical, and you can do more with a brass band and flag waving to get people to go along with you than you can with trying to talk to them using facts and so on. That part's true, and he didn't create that idea, of course. He simply is a good guy for copying a lot of stuff, and he got a lot of promotion through the media. But that's where you'll find that that is very true when it comes out of the mouths of these people, which tells you too that they're not the people who lead the country. In fact, most of them don't even know. I've talked so many times about all the different names, these organizations that run the planet, and all the different NGOs that work on their behalf and get government funding. And I'll guarantee you that there's not a leader in the world who knows a fraction of these names. It's all done. It is outside of government to an extent, although the government will sign automatically funding for them. And that's how what they call today democracy works. It's nothing to do with what the people want. Nothing. It hasn't been that way for an awful long time, what the people want. Isn't that a fact, eh? But as I say, you know, it'd be interesting to see. It doesn't really bother me at all, politics and who gets in, who doesn't get in, etc. Because, as I say, whoever gets in is run by the same people behind the scenes. If you think that well over 100 years of planning and altering the world along from one group in an agenda, and I've got given a lot of the history of this one group in the agenda, do you think they're going to turn back and say, oh, well, we got beat fair and square because they voted in so-and-so? Do you think they'd stop and just give up and go home? Do you really think that? Of course they wouldn't. You're dealing with people who plan wars in advance. Remember the part of their group called the PNAC group? That was only one little part of it for the US. But they had all the list of countries to be taken out, and they published it before 9/11 happened. You remember these things if you want to understand how you're ruled. Big difference between being ruled and governed. Governed in a democracy or democratic sense means you've given consent. How many of you have given consent to a world government? How many of you gave consent to giving away your sovereignty, personal sovereignty, to a world habitat, whatever it happens to be, which is going to ensure that you have no real rights of property in Agenda 21. It's all written in there. Everything has got a caveat with permission of the government. You might do this, you might mow your lawn, you might blah, blah, blah. But eventually you have no property rights whatsoever. That's all to be banned. And eventually you'll be lucky to get enough heat to heat yourself and keep alive in the winter if you're on a bottom list, down near the bottom. I'm not kidding, folks. I'm not kidding. Well, from myself from Ontario, Canada, where at night it's below freezing already, has been for the last week or two, it's good night. And may your God or your gods go with you.